Hello, my name's Gavin, and this is Genre Books, and today we're returning to the world of Planet Stories with the second issue, Volume 1, Number 2, printed in spring 1940, still costing 20 cents. Before we talk about the contents of today's magazine, I'd like to talk about something which does happen a lot in literature, but seems a particular feature in pulp magazines, and that is the use of pseudonyms and further the use of house names. I picked this as a subject to think a little bit about first because this issue has 8 stories with 8 named authors, but there are only 7 writers here. There may be many reasons for a writer to employ a pseudonym. Perhaps they want to compartmentalize their pulp output, to have westerns under one name, horror under another, science fiction under yet another name. They could want to use it to distinguish between their pulp output and what they might consider their serious literary output. Some may just want to disguise their identity altogether. Some writers may wish to hide any distinguishing characteristics of their name, whether that be ethnicity or gender. Some may just wish to not be recognised, as it may spoil their day job. Some may want to write for different magazines under different names so that they're not letting on that they are moonlighting, as it were. The use of pseudonyms is not specific to literature. Obviously, plenty of musicians, politicians, you name it, will use a different name or a variation of their name. But an extension of the pseudonym is the house name. This is where many different writers all write under a given name for an author of a particular series or style. The house name can be seen in the precursors of pulp, in the Penny Dreadfuls or the dime novels. Examples such as Bertha M. Clay, who was a real author until she died, and then plenty of other writers took that mantle, that moniker on, and continued literary output in her name. In the days of Penny Dreadfuls and dime novels, sometimes the character themselves was the narrator, hiding the name of the actual author. The character or the author becomes a brand name. There is brand recognition there. Alternatively, sometimes the narrator or the supposed author of the work is simply listed as no name. So no brand recognition at all, but again, masking the true identity of the writer. Famous examples in the world of pulp include Kenneth Robeson, the writer of the Doc Savage novels, who was mostly Lester Dent, but I believe was something like 10 different authors, including in later years Philip Jose Farmer and Ron Goulart. Ellery Queen in the detective world is plenty of different writers. Maxwell Grant of the Shadow novels, James Axler, Peter Saxon, and giving the game away a little, Brent House. It can be a fun little detective game to play on the side of piecing together who writers might be. Sometimes where 2 writers are collaborating, they will come up with a third composite or completely original name, and it is a challenge to figure out who the underlying writer was. Unless you have access to all of the information in the background of the history of the publication, it can be difficult to pin down exactly who did write what, and it's a fun little literary investigative sideline to try to identify different styles or overused plot points. There's no great insight to any of this. Most of the time this was just a matter of expediency, sometimes a little playfulness. I just thought it was worth mentioning something, considering that of the 7 authors of this particular issue of Planet Stories, all but one of them wrote under pseudonyms, or the name they are writing under for this issue was a pseudonym. So let's look at the contents of issue 2 of Planet Stories. John Murray Reynolds again takes the cover story with his novel Goddess of the Moon. In this novel, Earth is suffering from a plague known as the Grey Death. There is a treatment, and it's radium, but there isn't enough radium on Earth to treat all the people who are getting sick. Our hero, Larry Gibson, is a pilot who has been drummed out of the space pilot service because of an accident that he was framed for, and he finds himself down on his luck in a bar in New York when he comes across the mad scientist Crispin Gillingwater Ripon. He is cajoled, half-tricked into joining the crew. Spaceflight is not a regular occurrence. Ripon has re-engineered an old out-of-service rocket to take him and his crew to the moon. Trips to the moon in this world are very few and far between, and there doesn't seem to be much chance of success, but he is convinced that there are vast deposits of radium on the moon which he can retrieve to return to Earth and save the planet. They crash land, they discover insect-like life, but this life, these denizens of the moon are ruled by a young teenage girl who is the daughter of someone from a previous expedition to the moon, which in my very short list of John Murray Reynolds stories I've read seems to be a recurring feature already. There are other descendants of that first expedition to the moon, and they are the enemy in this story, and adventure ensues. The next tale is an Earthbound tale from Ray Cummings, The Girl from Infinite Smallness. Our hero here is George Carter, a teenage boy, young adult, who discovers microscopic life in his back garden. A girl appears who has come from that microscopic world via the use of a potion. She's not of the human race, or not entirely, and lives on the sundial in their backyard. There is strife in this microscopic world which she feels she must return to, and George goes along to help. It's an entertaining enough story, but by this point in his career this seems to be a well-worn path for Cummings, something which the letter writers in the following issue don't fail to take note of. The next story is Martian Terror by Ed Earl Repp. Now, this is an interesting story insofar as it's very unusual in pulp science fiction to find a story where there are no humans. Here there are Martians and Venusians. Earth seems to be ignored completely, and Venus is being dominated by Mars, and we follow a Martian soldier stationed on Venus who begins to develop a conscience over what they're doing to the Venusians. There is an uprising planned by Atarchus, one of the Venusian leaders, and his daughter Mora, who our hero Lohan seems to have taken a shine to, and as a result of this uprising and perhaps that attraction, he joins them in what unfolds as the usual pulp blend of high drama, caverns, ray guns and adventure. In Ross Rocklin's The Tantalus Death, the tables are turned somewhat. Mars is now dominated and under embargo from Earth, who are restricting the use of water to their planet, following a long, protracted war between the two planets. Mars finds a way to retaliate against this, and the title, The Tantalus Death, may give an indication of how they go about this, but I won't say much more because this is a short story which is quite a lot of fun. The next story, Revolt on the Earth Star by Carl Selwyn, is set in a future Earth. Our hero, Rod Carver, has had an accident at the very beginning of the story and looks like he has died, but he is resurrected millennia later as a machine. The world is run by a group of machines, a race who call themselves the Capex, presumably in tribute to Carol Capek and his Rossum's Universal Robots. The remaining humans are kept as stock or cattle. Rod sympathises with the plight of the humans, even if the humans can't see their plight themselves until it's pointed out to them, and plans a way to help them free themselves from the yoke of these machines. The next story is The Space Flame by Alexander M. Phillips, and here is the only writer who doesn't or hadn't written under a pseudonym and never did. This short story is set on a spaceship in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, and the crew, who are mid-mutiny, discover a protoplasmic being who begins to pick the crew off one by one. The next story is a very short one and is written by Ray King, who is Ray Cummings, and it's called The Man Who Killed the World. It's a brief portrait of a man, a madman, who is dictator of the earth, who gets everything that he wanted, can't figure out quite what he's looking for, goes to extremes of depravity to do so, and still never quite gets it. And the final story in this issue is Dictator of Time by Nelson S. Bond. In this tale, a man and a woman are snatched from an escalator in a New York train station, snatched away to the future, where they are kept in some kind of menagerie by the race that inhabits the earth by this point. I think 100,000 years in the future, I believe, and find themselves under the immediate threat of vivisection. And this story is purely their struggle to escape that fate. So that makes up the fiction in this issue. 2 novels, 3 novelettes, and 3 short stories. And in case you're wondering, as I first was, where to delineate between a novella, a novel, a novelette, and a short story, a novel seems to be 40,000 words plus, a novella between 17,000 and 40,000, a novelette between 7,500 and 14,000, and a short story anything up to and including 7,500 words. Doesn't include flash fiction. There was no flash fiction back in 1940. Issue 2 is the first issue of Planet Stories to feature fan letters, although using the word fan may be stretching the point a little. It's interesting to note that in the correspondence in this first issue, you can see that people have written in to the magazine, and the editor has responded to them by mail in order to get a response back again. So 2 letters from the same correspondent are received in the same issue, which was something I've not seen in a letters page before, and showed up the communication that is going on, and also called out the at least one of the respondents a little bit. And what was his name? Olon F. Wiggins, the editor of the Science Fiction Fan, who really did not like what he was seeing in this magazine, yet would continue to buy it purely so that you would have something presumably to moan about. And the editor says, fair enough, those are your thoughts, other people haven't had that reaction, but please tell us what it is that you'd like to see. And he responds to say, "Oh, I'm not telling you." This seems to be quite petulant on the correspondent's part, but I'm sure it is something very recognisable to anyone who's engaged in social media in the last 2 decades. Other than finding out that the readers of these first issues of Planet Stories pull no punches when it comes to reviewing and commenting upon them, I find that in their writing they are still using STF as an abbreviation, not sci-fi, not SF, because they still weren't talking about science fiction. Although I think that term had passed into use by this point, these writers are still talking scientifiction. I have no idea how it's actually supposed to be pronounced. You'll have to ask Hugo Gernsback. But I think the example of some of these correspondents clinging to the old usage is indicative of a certain conservatism which is already creeping into the science fiction community at this point, even in this pre-atomic age. And I would just wonder if it's ever been thus. But to return to our featured writer for this particular episode, and that is John Murray Reynolds. This is the last time that John Murray Reynolds appeared in the pages of Planet Stories, after having secured the first 2 cover stories. Although the response in the letters to his stories is so lukewarm and sometimes antagonistic that this may be the reason he's dropped. But John Murray Reynolds was a veteran of the pulps. He is someone who did have a day job. I believe he worked for a shipping company and started to thrash these stories out on his commute home. He was a regular for Fiction House being the publisher of Planet Stories, and he also wrote for Civil War Stories, Indian Stories, Jungle Stories, Frontier Stories, and Sea Stories. I don't think I need to tell you what all those magazines were about individually, but he also wrote for Weird Tales, Bullseye Detective, Golden Fleece, High Adventure, Boy's Life, the 5 Novels magazine, Thrilling Adventure, Top Notch Adventure, and Short Stories. So a fair amount of output from him. And he was also one of the originators, I don't know if he did it by himself or in collaboration, of Kigor, King of the Jungle, who appeared in Jungle Stories from 1938 to 1954, writing under the house name, here we go, of John Peter Drummond. And Kigor is, let's be frank, a Tarzan imitation, but obviously well received to be written about for such a length of time. As well as writing for the pulps, John Murray Reynolds also wrote for the Slicks on their nice glossy paper, the likes of magazines such as Liberty or Cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitan was a very different magazine before the Second World War, obviously, and I don't think he would get many of his stories featured these days. John Murray Reynolds wrote 150 stories, only 8 of which had fantastic or science fiction or even scientific fiction basis, and wrote 7 novels, only 1 of which had a fantastic basis. He was primarily an adventure writer, and of the 2 short novels that I've read in these 2 issues of Planet Stories, that certainly comes out. It's very kinetic. There are lots of different things happening. Not everything always makes sense, and at some point during the Amazon warriors of Venus, well, they all decide to jump on dolphins to escape underwater. The flights of fantasy really can take a very unscientific turn, but for all that, they are pure Saturday morning cartoon entertainment. delivering a lot of excitement and not a huge amount of depth. But unfortunately, that's all I've got to say about him. I can't find much more information about him other than that he did have this job, I believe, at a steamship company. It may have been in logistics, it may have been in insurance. There's no picture that I can find, and he appears to be out of print. Stories are available on Gutenberg or on the Internet Archive, but the only book I could find was a copy of his fantastic novel, The Private Life of Henry Perkins, second-hand on Abe Books. Just the one copy. But I think that's one of the reasons I want to go through this project, because until I've read all these stories I won't know, but there may be other writers worth reading who just aren't in the, I won't say the public consciousness, but not even in the science fiction fan or the genre fan consciousness any longer, who it is worth digging out and rediscovering. Issue 3, the summer of 1940, sees a return of Ray Cummings and Ross Racklin and Carl Selwyn, but also the introduction of Neil R. Jones, Harry Walton, John Russell Fearn and Sam Carson. As issue 3 will be his second appearance in Planet Stories, or third if you count the Ray King story, the featured writer in the next Planet Stories deep dive will be Ray Cummings, who there is a little more information about. I'll be back soon with that or some other nonsense shortly. Bye.